July 1943. The dusty, sun-scorched hills of Sicily tremble under the treads of American Shermans and British Cromwells. In the command tent of the U.S. 7th Army, a man stands over a map, his eyes burning with an intensity that unnerves even his closest staff officers. He wears high cavalry boots, a helmet polished to a mirror sheen, and at his waist, a revolver with an ivory handle. He is General George Smith Patton, Jr., and he is arguably the most aggressive, talented, and feared combat commander the United States has ever produced. To the public back home, he is old blood and guts, the hero who turned the tide in North Africa. To the German High Command, he is the adversary they respect the most, the only Allied general who understands the fluid, violent art of mobile warfare. But to his superiors, to Dwight D, Eisenhower, and Omar Bradley, he is something else entirely. He is a ticking time bomb. History remembers Patton as the man who raced across France and relieved Bastogne. But the question that haunted the Allied High Command throughout the war, and which remains a subject of intense debate among historians today, is not why Patton was successful, but why he was consistently passed over for the highest commands. Why, when an invasion of Europe was planned, was the best battlefield general not given the lead? The answer lies not in his tactical ability, which was peerless, but in a fatal flaw that no amount of bravery could fix. Patton was a man born out of the century, a warrior mystic fighting a modern, bureaucratic, and political war that he fundamentally did not understand. To understand why the leash was never taken off, we must go back to where the legend and the liability began. If you are fascinated by the complex personalities that shaped the outcome of the Second World War and want to support deep-dive historical analysis that goes beyond the textbooks, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these critical stories of command and strategy. To understand the friction between Patton and the Allied leadership, we must first look at the state of the American Army in late 1942. The United States was new to the war in the European theater, and the learning curve was steep and bloody. In November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. By February 1943, they had suffered a humiliating, catastrophic defeat at the Kasserine Pass. The U.S. II Corps was routed by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Equipment was abandoned, discipline collapsed, and American morale hit rock bottom. Eisenhower needed a fixer. He needed someone who could take a group of terrified, disorganized draftees and turn them into a killing machine. He sent for Patton. When Patton arrived at the II Corps headquarters, the atmosphere changed instantly. He didn't just bring orders. He brought a terrified awe. He imposed strict discipline immediately. Soldiers were fined for not wearing their gaiters or neckties, even in the heat of battle. It seemed petty to the men, but Patton understood that an army that looks like a mob fights like a mob. Within weeks, the II Corps was transformed. They won the Battle of El Getter. Patton had proven his thesis: aggression and discipline win battles. However, this success masked a deeper issue that was already worrying Eisenhower. Patton viewed war as a personal duel, a gladiator match where honor and glory were the ultimate currency. He believed in reincarnation, claiming he had fought with the Roman legions and Napoleon's marshals. While this added to his charisma, it terrified the planners in London and Washington. The Second World War was not a duel. It was a massive industrial coalition effort. It required diplomacy, patience, and the ability to work alongside the British, specifically the difficult but essential Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Patton loathed Montgomery. He viewed him as slow, cautious, and arrogant. This personal animosity wasn't just professional jealousy. It was a strategic liability. Eisenhower's job was to keep the alliance together. Patton's instinct was to fracture it in pursuit of personal glory. This tension exploded during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, codenamed Operation Husky. The plan, drafted largely by the British, relegated Patton's 7th Army to a supporting role. Montgomery's 8th Army was to drive up the east coast of the island to capture the port of Messina, effectively cutting off the German retreat. Patton was merely supposed to cover Montgomery's left flank. To a man like Patton, playing bodyguard to a rival he despised was an insult. What followed was a campaign that showcased both Patton's brilliance and his uncontrollability. Instead of staying on the flank as ordered, Patton went rogue. He pushed his army north and west, capturing Palermo in a lightning thrust that shocked both the Germans and his own superiors. It was a headline-grabbing victory, a masterclass in mobility, but strategically it was questionable. While Patton was collecting trophies in Palermo, the German forces were executing a disciplined fighting retreat toward Messina. Patton then turned his eyes toward Messina. It became a race. He was determined to beat Montgomery to the city, not necessarily to trap the Germans, but to humiliate the British commander. He drove his men relentlessly. The heat was blistering, the terrain mountainous, and the German resistance fanatical. Patton was everywhere, screaming, cajoling, and pushing the Seventh Army to its breaking point. He famously said, "I don't want any messages saying I am holding my position. We are not holding anything. Let the Hun do that." While the American public cheered the capture of Palermo and the rapid advance, Eisenhower was watching with growing concern. Patton was treating the campaign like a private war. He was interpreting orders loosely or ignoring them entirely if they didn't suit his ambition. In a coalition war, trust is the most valuable commodity. If a commander cannot be trusted to follow the broader strategic plan because he is chasing personal glory, he becomes dangerous. Eisenhower admired Patton's drive, but he was beginning to see that Patton lacked the temperament for the delicate balancing act that the upcoming invasion of France would require. And then, in the dust and heat of the Sicilian campaign, with the pressure mounting and the casualties piling up, the dam broke. The warrior's temper, which had fueled his drive, turned inward against his own men. It was an incident that would nearly end his career, an incident that confirmed every fear the high command had about his stability. It didn't happen on a map or in a strategy meeting, but in a field hospital tent, where the line between discipline and cruelty would be irrevocably crossed. As the race from Messina reached its climax, Patton's psychological state was fraying. He was obsessed with beating Montgomery, obsessed with his own destiny, and intolerant of anything he perceived as weakness. This volatile mix was about to explode in a moment that would stain his reputation forever and hand his political enemies the ammunition they needed to ensure that George S. Patton would never, ever be the supreme commander. The slapping incidents were imminent, and they would prove to Eisenhower that while Patton could conquer territory, he could not conquer himself. The heat inside the medical tent of the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily, was suffocating on the afternoon of August 3rd, 1943. The air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and dried blood. General Patton moved through the rows of cots, pinning Purple Hearts onto the chests of men torn apart by shrapnel and machine gun fire. He was in his element, playing the role of the benevolent father to his warrior sons. He knelt by the beds, whispering words of encouragement, visibly moved by the physical sacrifice of his troops. But then, he reached a bed where a young soldier sat upright, fully dressed, with no visible wounds. Patton asked the man where he was hurt. The soldier, Private Charles Cole, looked up with hollow, terrified eyes and stammered, "I guess I just can't take it." To a modern observer, or even to the medical officers present in that tent, the diagnosis was clear: combat stress reaction or battle fatigue. The mind had shattered before the body. But to George Patton, whose worldview was forged in the chivalric codes of the 19th century and the brutal realities of the First World War, there was no such thing as psychological trauma. There was only courage and cowardice. In that moment, the benevolent father vanished, replaced by the vengeful god of war. Patton slapped the soldier across the face with his gloves. He grabbed him by the collar, threw him out of the tent, and screamed, "Don't admit this son of a bitch. There is no such thing as shell shock. It's an invention of the Jews." It was a shocking display, but amazingly, it happened again just 1 week later. On August 10th, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, Patton encountered Private Paul Bennett, who was shivering uncontrollably on a cot. When Bennett wept and said, "It's my nerves," Patton exploded. He slapped the soldier so hard his helmet liner flew off. He drew his pearl-handled revolver and threatened to shoot the man right there for cowardice. The medical staff was horrified. The colonel in charge of the hospital stood between the general and the private, effectively ordering his superior officer to stand down. If you believe it is important to analyze the psychological toll of war alongside the strategic decisions, please subscribe to our channel. We strive to present a complete picture of history, warts and all, Eisenhower, sitting in his headquarters in Algiers, was soon handed a report on the incidents. He was furious. He knew that if this story leaked to the American press, the public outcry would be deafening. Mothers and fathers who had sent their sons to fight tyranny would not tolerate a general who abused their children in hospital beds. Eisenhower wrote Patton a blistering private letter, ordering him to apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and the troops. Patton, humbled and terrified of losing his command, complied. He went on a tour of his divisions, delivering awkward, rambling apologies. He thought the storm had passed. But in November 1943, the columnist Drew Pearson broke the story on his radio show. The reaction was exactly what Eisenhower had feared. The American public was outraged. Congressmen demanded Patton's court-martial. The Senate delayed his promotion. The old blood and guts nickname was suddenly reinterpreted. It was his guts, but their blood. Eisenhower was faced with an impossible choice. He knew Patton was his best fighter. He knew that to win the war in Europe, he might need Patton's killer instinct. But he also knew that he could not give supreme command to a man who was so politically toxic and emotionally unstable. The decision Eisenhower made would shape the rest of the war. He saved Patton from dismissal, but he stripped him of his destiny. When the plans were drawn up for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, Patton assumed he would lead the main assault. He was the most experienced, the most successful, and the most senior combat commander in the theater. But the command of the U.S. First Army, the force that would storm Omaha and Utah beaches, was given to Omar Bradley. Bradley, the GI's general, was quiet, steady, and dependable. He was everything Patton was not. Patton would not be leading the charge. He was put on the bench. For months, while his peers were in London planning the greatest amphibious assault in history, Patton sat in a requisition villa in Sicily and later in a farmhouse in England, stewing in depression and paranoia. He believed there was a conspiracy against him. He felt useless. But the Allied High Command had one more use for the disgraced general. If they couldn't trust him with a real army, they would trust him with a fake one. This was Operation Fortitude, one of the most successful intelligence deceptions in warfare. The Allies knew that the Germans respected Patton above all other commanders. German intelligence could not conceive that the Americans would sideline their best general for a slap. They assumed Patton must be leading the invasion. So, Eisenhower placed Patton in charge of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. It sounds impressive, but FUSAG was a ghost army. It existed only on paper in the form of inflatable rubber tanks, plywood gliders, and fake radio traffic station in Dover, directly across from the Pas de Calais. The goal was to convince the Germans that the invasion would land at Calais, the shortest route across the Channel, and that Patton would lead the spearhead. Patton played his part. He was seen walking around Dover. He gave speeches to empty fields. And the Germans bought it. They kept their powerful 15th Army pinned down at Calais, waiting for Patton, while the real invasion force prepared for Normandy. It was a humiliating role for a man of Patton's ego, to be a scarecrow, but he performed it dutifully. However, the exile did not tame him. In April 1944, just weeks before D-Day, Patton attended a Welcome Club meeting in Knutsford, England. He gave a seemingly improvised speech where he remarked that it was the destiny of the United States and Great Britain to rule the world. He omitted the Russians. The press jumped on it. Patton slights Russia. The Soviets were furious. The scandal erupted all over again. Eisenhower was at his wit's end. He seriously considered sending Patton home for good. He wrote a letter relieving Patton of command, but kept it in his desk drawer. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, intervened. He essentially told Eisenhower, "You do what you have to do, but remember, you have a lot of hard fighting ahead." Eisenhower relented. He kept Patton. But the message was clear. Patton was on his last strike. He would not land on D-Day. He would not capture the glory of the first foothold. He would arrive later, leading the Third Army, a force that was strictly subordinate to Omar Bradley's command. As June 6, 1944, approached, Patton was a caged lion. He watched the weather reports. He watched the planes fly overhead toward France. He wrote in his diary about the agony of being left behind, while lesser men led the charge. He called Bradley a man of great mediocrity. He seethed with jealousy and frustration. But as the Allies landed on the beaches and soon found themselves bogged down in the dense, impenetrable hedgerows of Normandy, the war movement that Eisenhower had hoped for turned into a grinding stalemate. The cautious, methodical approach of Montgomery and Bradley was hitting a wall. The stalemate was costing thousands of lives. The Allies were stuck. They needed a breakout. They needed speed. They needed violence. And waiting in the wings, pacing in his headquarters, polishing his boots and studying the maps of France, was the one man who could give it to them. The leash was about to be loosened, not because they trusted him, but because they were desperate. July 1944. Normandy. The euphoria of D-Day has evaporated, replaced by the claustrophobic nightmare of the bocage. The hedgerow country is a defender's paradise and an attacker's hell. Ancient earthen banks, topped with thick, impenetrable hedges, divide the landscape into 1,000 tiny fortresses. American tanks are forced to crawl through narrow lanes, only to be ambushed by German Panthers and 88mm anti-tank guns hidden in the foliage. The Allies are advancing, but they are measuring their gains in yards, not miles. The casualty lists are growing terrifyingly long. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, is methodical and careful, but the stalemate is threatening to derail the entire liberation of Europe. The Allies are bottled up. They need a sledgehammer to break the wall, and they need a cavalryman to ride through the breach. On August 1st, 1944, the Phantom finally became flesh. The 3rd United States Army became operational. And George S. Patton was finally let off the leash. What followed was not just a military advance. It was a stampede. If you enjoy detailed breakdowns of military operations and the fascinating logistics that sustain them, please verify that you are subscribed. We are building a community of history enthusiasts who want to understand the how and why behind the major events of the 20th century. Operation Cobra, the plan to break out of the Normandy beachhead, was designed by Bradley, but was executed with Patton's spirit. Once the lines were breached near St. Lo, Patton poured his divisions through the gap like water bursting through a dam. While other generals might pause to secure their flanks or consolidate their supply lines, Patton issued orders that terrified his own staff. Forget the flanks. The enemy is behind us. Drive. The Third Army didn't just advance. It exploded across the French countryside. In 2 weeks, they covered distances that World War I generals would have expected to take 2 years. They swept through Brittany, then turned east, aiming for the heart of France. Patton's philosophy was simple. Speed is the best armor. If you move fast enough, the enemy cannot organize a defense. He ordered his tank commanders to bypass strong points, leaving them for the infantry to clean up later. Haul ass and bypass became the mantra. The Germans were bewildered. Their communications were cut, their command posts overrun, and their retreat routes blocked before they even knew the Americans were in the area. But even in this moment of supreme professional vindication, the tension between Patton and his superiors reemerged with a vengeance. The first major flashpoint was the Falaise Pocket. By mid-August, the German 7th Army was trapped. The Canadians and Polish, under Montgomery's command, were pushing down from the north. Patton's 3rd Army was hooking up from the south. They were like the jaws of a giant trap, closing around 100,000 German soldiers. Patton's 15 Corps reached the town of Argenton. They were barely a dozen miles from the Canadians at Falaise. Patton could see the smoke from the British artillery. He radioed Bradley, begging for permission to close the gap. He famously boasted, "Let me go. I have a telephone cable around their necks, and I am ready to pull the knot tight." He wanted to drive north and destroy the German army completely. Bradley said no. He ordered Patton to halt at Argenton. Why? Bradley later cited fear of friendly fire, that American and Canadian armies crashing into each other would result in chaos. He also cited the agreed-upon boundary lines. But Patton saw it differently. He saw it as a lack of nerve, a bureaucratic hesitation that allowed tens of thousands of hardened German SS and Panzer troops to escape the trap and live to fight another day. To Patton, this was a cause of control. The High Command was so obsessed with lines on a map and keeping Montgomery happy that they sacrificed total victory. The gap was eventually closed, but days later, and after many Germans had slipped away. Despite this frustration, Patton turned his army east and began the race across France. The liberation of Paris in late August was a global celebration, but for Patton, it was a distraction. He wanted the Rhine. He wanted Berlin. By late August, the Third Army seemed unstoppable. They were advancing 40 to 60 miles a day. The German resistance in the west had collapsed. There was nothing between Patton and the German border except open road. But modern army is a beast with insatiable appetite. A Sherman tank consumes gallons of fuel every mile. A division fires tons of ammunition every hour. And all of these supplies had to be trucked from the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles away, via the Red Ball Express. As the Allied army stretched out across France, the supply line snapped. There simply wasn't enough gasoline to keep everyone moving at full speed. Eisenhower was faced with the most critical strategic decision of the campaign. He had two choices. Option A was a broad front strategy. Advance everyone. Montgomery in the north, Bradley in the center, Patton in the south, slowly and steadily, keeping the pressure on all sectors. Option B was a narrow thrust. Halt everyone else. Give all the gas to one commander and let him punch a single, decisive hole into Germany to end the war by Christmas. Patton, naturally, screamed for the single thrust. He argued that if Eisenhower gave him the fuel, he could cross the Rhine in days. Montgomery, equally arrogant, argued that he should get the fuel for a thrust into the Ruhr in the north. Eisenhower chose the broad front. He was a political general running a coalition. He could not tell the British public that their hero Montgomery was being told to sit still while the American cowboy Patton won the war. Nor could he risk a single thrust being cut off and destroyed. So he spread the gasoline thin. On August 31st, 1944, the unthinkable happened. The Third Army, the fastest mechanized force in history, ran dry. Patton's tanks stopped near the Moselle River, just miles from the German border and the Siegfried Line. The engines fell silent. The guns went quiet. Patton was furious. He raged at his headquarters. He sent officers to steal gas from other units. He wrote in his diary that he was up against two enemies, the Germans and his own high command. To Patton, this was not logistics. It was a sabotage. He believed that jealous superiors, specifically Eisenhower and Bradley, were deliberately slowing him down to let Montgomery catch up. He believed that the broad front was a euphemism for mediocrity. While Patton sat immobile near Metz, giving the Germans precious weeks to regroup and fortify the Siegfried Line, Montgomery was given priority for a daring new operation in the north called Market Garden. The leash had been pulled tight at the very moment the prey was in sight. Patton was paralyzed not by German panzers, but by the allocation of jerrycans. The delay at the Moselle would prove costly. The Germans, who had been routed and disorganized, used the pause to dig in. When Patton finally got enough fuel to move again in October and November, the easy war movement was over. He was no longer racing across sunny fields. He was staring at the muddy, frozen fortifications of Metz and the Hürtgen forest. The window of opportunity had slammed shut, and as the autumn rains turned the ground to mud, the friction between the man who wanted to win and the men who wanted to manage the war would reach a new peak. The leash was about to chafe harder than ever, as Patton's mouth would once again threaten to destroy what his tanks had built. September 1944. The summer of speed is dead. The sun-drenched fields of France, where Patton's Sherman tanks had roamed like cavalry chargers, have disappeared. In their place is a gray, weeping landscape of mud, fog, and rotting leaves. The General Mudd has arrived, and he is a far more formidable opponent than the Wehrmacht. For the Third Army, the halt at the Meuse River due to the gasoline shortage was not just a pause. It was a death sentence for the war movement. By the time the fuel trucks finally arrived in sufficient numbers in October, the Germans had done what they do best. They had dug in. Patton was no longer racing for Berlin. He was staring at the ancient fortress city of Metz. This was not the war George Patton wanted to fight. This was not the war of sweeping flanks and hauling ass. This was a siege. It was a brutal, grinding, First World War-style slugfest against concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and an enemy who had their backs to the border of their homeland. The leash of logistics had held Patton back just long enough for the door to slam shut. Now he would have to kick it down inch by bloody inch. If you are finding this analysis of the operational level of war valuable, specifically the transition from maneuver warfare to attrition, please subscribe to the channel. Understanding these shifts is key to understanding why the war in Europe dragged on into 1945. The Battle of Metz is often glossed over in popular histories, sandwiched between the glamour of the breakout and the drama of the bulge. But for the men of the Third Army, it was a horror show. Metz was surrounded by a ring of heavy forts built in the late 19th century and modernized by the Germans. Fort Driant, Fort Jeanne d'Arc. These were subterranean labyrinths of reinforced concrete, armed with heavy artillery that could rain death on any approach. Patton, frustrated by the delay and eager to regain momentum, ordered frontal assaults. He believed his men could smash through anything. He was wrong. The attacks on Fort Driant were catastrophic. American infantry were chewed up in the tunnels and blast furnaces of the fort system. It was a failure of imagination on Patton's part, a rare moment where his tactical acumen seemed blinded by his impatience. He was trying to force a blitzkrieg tempo on a siege war reality. His superiors, Bradley and Eisenhower, watched with growing concern. Patton was bogged down. The miracle worker was bleeding his army white in the Lorraine mud. Meanwhile, to the north, the reason for Patton's fuel shortage was playing out in tragic fashion. Field Marshal Montgomery had launched Operation Market Garden, the massive airborne invasion of the Netherlands. It was a narrow thrust that Patton had begged for, but it was being led by his rival. The plan was audacious: seize the bridges across the Rhine and open the back door to the Ruhr industrial heartland. But as history records, it was a bridge too far. The British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed at Arnhem. The operation failed to end the war. For Patton, the failure of Market Garden was a bitter vindication. He had been starved of fuel so that Montgomery could fail. In his diary, he poured out his venom against the decision-making of the Supreme Allied headquarters. He believed that if that gasoline had been given to the Third Army in August, he would be sitting in Frankfurt by now. Instead, he was stuck in the mud, fighting for a few hundred yards of territory a day. As November dragged into December, the Allied advance along the entire Western Front ground to a halt. The broad front strategy had succeeded in bringing everyone to the German border, but it had failed to punch through. The Allied armies were stretched thin, exhausted, and complacent. Intelligence reports suggested that the German army was finished. They were battered, scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel, using old men and young boys to fill the ranks. The Allied High Command believed the Germans were incapable of offensive action. They believed the only question left was how long it would take for the Nazis to surrender. This hubris infected everyone, from Eisenhower and Versailles to the sentries on the line. Everyone, perhaps, except Patton. In the Third Army sector, despite the gloom and the mud, Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, was noticing something disturbing. The Germans were withdrawing their best panzer divisions from the line opposite Patton. They were vanishing. Where were they going? Allied intelligence assumed they were moving to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians, or simply refitting for a final defense of the Rhine. But Patton was suspicious. He was a student of military history, and he knew that the Germans had a penchant for counterattacks. He told his staff, "The crowd is up to something." While the rest of the Allied leadership was planning their Christmas leaves, Patton quietly ordered his staff to draw up contingency plans. He asked a strange question: what if we have to turn the whole army 90 degrees to the north? It was a premonition that bordered on the psychic. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Hitler had stripped the Eastern Front and gathered the last reserves of the Third Reich. The 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, the elite SS divisions. He had massed them in the dense, snowy forests of the Ardennes, the Ghost Front, a quiet sector held by tired American units sent there to rest. Hitler's plan was insane but terrifying: a massive surprise attack to split the British and American armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It was Operation Walk am Rhein. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered by the roar of 1,000 German guns. King Tigers and Panthers emerged from the mist, rolling over the stunned American defenders. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Panic swept through the Allied command. The front line was broken. American units were surrendering. The road to the Meuse River was open. In Eisenhower's headquarters, the mood was grim. Reserves were scarce. The only available force that had the power to strike back was heavily engaged in the south, locked in combat in the Saar region. It was Patton's Third Army. Eisenhower called a frantic emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. All the top commanders were there: Bradley, Devers, Tedder, and Patton. The atmosphere was tense. The Germans were moving fast. Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the impossible. He wanted to know how long it would take for Patton to disengage from his current battle, turn his entire army, hundreds of thousands of men in vehicles, 90 degrees to the left, and march north into the snow to hit the German flank. The other generals expected Patton to say 2 weeks. Maybe 10 days if he pushed hard. Maneuvering an army in winter conditions is a logistical nightmare. It takes days just to turn the trucks around. Patton looked at Eisenhower, his eyes gleaming with a mix of defiance and supreme confidence. He didn't hesitate. He delivered the line that would define his legacy and prove, once and for all, why he was the indispensable man of the European theater. He said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours." The room went silent. The other generals laughed nervously. It was physically impossible. It was a boast. It was typical Patton bluster. But Patton wasn't smiling. He had the contingency plan in his pocket. He had already issued the code words to his staff before he even walked into the meeting. The leash had been completely removed by the crisis. The alliance was in mortal danger, and the mad general was the only one who could save it. When George Patton walked out of the conference room of Verdun on December 19th, 1944, the other generals shook their heads. They believed he was grandstanding. To disengage a corps of 3 divisions from active combat, pivot them 90 degrees on icy roads, and launch a coordinated counterattack in the flank of a massive enemy offensive, all within 48 hours, was a logistical impossibility. It violated the laws of physics and military science. But what Eisenhower and the others did not know was that Patton wasn't starting from scratch. He had already started the movement. While the other commanders were debating strategy, Patton's military police were already nailing up new directional signs on the frozen crossroads of France. The Third Army was not just a fighting force. By this point in the war, it was an extension of Patton's own nervous system. What followed over the next few days is rightly considered one of the greatest feats of operational maneuver in the history of warfare. In the midst of one of the worst blizzards in European history, with temperatures plummeting and visibility near zero, Patton moved 133,000 vehicles and hundreds of thousands of men over 100 miles of single-track roads. He did it without radio silence, without lights, and without chaos. It was a ballet of steel performed on ice. If you are interested in the granular details of logistics, the fuel consumption, the traffic control, the map reading under fire, that make operations like this possible, please subscribe. We are dedicated to exploring the mechanics of history, not just mythology. The target of this lightning strike was a small, strategic crossroads town of Bastogne. Inside the town, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off, and running low on ammunition. The German commander had demanded their surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, had replied with a single word: nuts. It was a legendary act of defiance. But defiance doesn't stop tank shells. The paratroopers were holding the line, but they needed a miracle. They needed Patton. But even Patton couldn't fight the weather. The Allied Air Force, which guaranteed supremacy, was grounded by the thick cloud cover. Patton, in a moment that perfectly encapsulates his bizarre mix of piety and profanity, summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. He ordered the chaplain to write a prayer for good weather. He famously asked, "Chaplain, are you on good terms with the Lord? I want you to deliver a prayer to break this weather." The chaplain wrote it. Patton had it printed on thousands of cards and distributed to the troops. And, whether by divine intervention or meteorological coincidence, the skies cleared on December 23rd. The P-47 Thunderbolts roared into the sky, smashing the German columns. Patton's tanks, led by the 4th Armored Division, smashed into the German southern flank. On December 26, 1944, the lead tank of Patton's relief force, commanded by Lieutenant Creighton Abrams, broke through the German lines and linked up with the 101st Airborne. Bastogne was saved. The German offensive was stalled. Patton had delivered on his impossible promise. He was the hero of the hour. But almost immediately, the leash was tightened again. With the German bulge contained, the question was how to eliminate it. Patton proposed a strategy that was characteristically aggressive. He wanted to bite off the German salient at the base. He wanted to drive deep behind the German lines and cut off the retreat of the entire Panzer Army, annihilating them in a chaotic pocket. It was a high-risk, high-reward move. Eisenhower and Bradley, ever the cautious managers, said no. They preferred a slow, methodical squeeze, pushing the Germans back from the nose of the bulge rather than cutting them off at the neck. They feared Patton would overextend himself. Patton was furious. He argued that the squeeze would allow the Germans to conduct an orderly retreat and save their equipment to fight another day. History proved Patton largely right. The Germans did manage to extract a significant portion of their armor because the Allies were too cautious. Once again, Patton felt that the timidity of the High Command was prolonging the war. As 1945 dawned, the Third Army resumed its drive into the heart of the Reich. The Palatinate campaign that followed was a masterpiece of ruthless efficiency. Patton cleared the Sarmozel Triangle, capturing thousands of Germans. By March, he was standing at the banks of the Rhine River, the psychological and physical barrier to the German heartland. Montgomery in the north was preparing a massive, set-piece crossing of the Rhine. It was to be a grand spectacle, involving airborne drops, massive artillery barges, and weeks of buildup. Patton, driven by his intense rivalry, decided to steal the show. On the night of March 22, 1945, without any fanfare or massive bombardment, the Third Army quietly slipped across the Rhine at Nierstein. When morning came, Patton was on the other side. He famously stopped halfway across a pontoon bridge to urinate into the river, a crude but symbolic gesture of dominance over the terrifying barrier that had stopped armies for centuries. He radioed headquarters. "I have crossed the Rhine. I have slipped across without any preparation. There are few Germans here. I am waiting for the rest of the army to catch up." He had beaten Montgomery again. Now, the road to Berlin seemed open. The German army in the west was dissolving. Resistance was sporadic. Patton smelled the end. He wanted to drive his tanks straight to the Reichstag. He wanted to be the man to accept the German surrender. But politics, the one enemy Patton could never defeat, intervened. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had divided the post-war world. They had drawn lines on a map. Berlin was in the Soviet zone of occupation. It had been decided diplomatically that the Red Army would take the capital. Eisenhower knew this. He knew that spending American lives to capture a city that would just be handed over to the Soviets the next day was pointless. He ordered the American armies to halt at the Elbe River and turn south toward a mythical national redoubt in the Alps. When Patton received the order to stop, he was apoplectic. To him, war was about winning. It was about taking the enemy's capital. He could not understand the geopolitical calculus. He argued with Eisenhower. He told him that they should take Berlin and then, if necessary, keep going. Patton was beginning to voice a sentiment that would become his undoing. As he saw the ragged columns of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, and as he encountered the Red Army officers at the link-up points, his anti-communist paranoia flared into open hostility. He famously stated to an increasingly uncomfortable staff, "We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along." He suggested that the U.S. Army should not demobilize, but should rearm the German divisions they had just defeated and use them to push the Soviets back to Russia. "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later," he said. "Why not do it now while we're already here and our army is intact?" This was radioactive talk. The Soviet Union was still an ally. The war in the Pacific was still raging, and the U.S. needed Soviet help to defeat Japan. For a high-ranking American general to openly advocate for World War III was not just insubordination. It was a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen. Eisenhower had tolerated Patton's slapping of soldiers, his insults to Montgomery, and his rogue tactical moves because Patton won battles. But now, the battles were ending. The utility of the mad dog was running out. As the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, George Patton stood at the zenith of his military power. He commanded the most lethal army the world had ever seen. He was a conqueror of nations, but he was a man without a war. And without a war to fight, George Patton was about to become the most dangerous man in peacetime Europe. The leash was about to be put on permanently, not by a general, but by the changing world order that had no place left for a Roman gladiator. May 8th, 1945, V-Day. The guns fell silent across Europe. For millions of soldiers and civilians, it was a moment of ecstatic relief. The nightmare was over. But for General George S. Patton, the silence was deafening. He famously said, "Peace is going to be hell on me." He was right. The very qualities that had made him a titan on the battlefield, his ruthlessness, his singleness of purpose, his lack of diplomatic filter, made him a catastrophic liability in the delicate, complex world of post-war occupation. The leash that Eisenhower had struggled to hold during the war was about to snap. But this time, the consequences would not be a breakthrough. They would be a career-ending implosion. Patton was appointed the military governor of Bavaria. His job was no longer to kill Germans, but to govern them. He was tasked with rebuilding a shattered society, restoring electricity and water, and most importantly, carrying out the strict Allied policy of denazification. The order was clear: remove all members of the Nazi Party from positions of power and influence. Bankers, judges, mayors, civil engineers. If they had worn the swastika, they were to be fired. If you have watched this entire series, thank you. Your time and interest help keep history alive. If you want to see more biographies of complex military figures, please subscribe and leave a comment suggesting who we should cover next, perhaps MacArthur or Rommel. To Patton, the denazification order was practical nonsense. He looked at the ruins of Munich and Nuremberg and saw a logistical problem, not a moral one. He needed the trains to run. He needed the sewers fixed. He needed the banks to open. And the only people who knew how to run the trains and the banks were the people who had been running them for the last 12 years. The Nazis. Patton, with his characteristic pragmatism, decided to ignore the direct orders of his superiors. He kept former Nazis in key administrative posts. When questioned by his officers, he waved them off, arguing that he couldn't run a province with inexperienced amateurs. He didn't care about their politics. He cared about their competence. This attitude terrified the Allied High Command. The world was just beginning to learn the full scale of the Holocaust. The concentration camps were being liberated, revealing horrors that defied description. And here was the most famous American general, essentially saying that the ideology of the perpetrators didn't matter as long as they were efficient administrators. Patton was viewing the Nazis through the lens of 19th century warfare as a defeated honorable enemy, rather than through the lens of the 20th century, where they were viewed as criminal monsters. The tension reached a breaking point on September 22, 1945. Patton held a press conference. Reporters, sensing blood, pressed him on why he was retaining Nazis in government jobs. Patton, frustrated and impatient, tried to use an analogy to explain his thinking. He said that the Nazi Party was just a political party, like the Republicans and Democrats. The comment was a public relations nuclear explosion. To compare the perpetrators of the final solution to American political parties was an insult so profound it made headlines around the globe. In Washington and London, the reaction was immediate and furious. Eisenhower, who had saved Patton from the slapping incidents, who had saved him from the Knutsford speech, and who had given him the Third Army, finally realized there was no saving him this time. The war was over. The need for a mad dog fighter was gone. Now, they needed diplomats, and Patton had just proven he was incapable of diplomacy. On September 29, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt. The meeting was short and icy. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the beloved army he had led across France. He was transferred to command of the 15th Army, a paper army tasked with writing a history of the war. It was a humiliating demotion. The lion was not just leashed. He was put in a cage. Patton was devastated. He felt betrayed by the country he had served for 40 years. He sank into a deep depression. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, that he felt like a package that has been wrapped up and put on the shelf. He spoke openly of resigning his commission and going on a speaking tour to warn the American people about the Soviet threat and the weakness of the Allied leadership. He was becoming a loose cannon, a potential political martyr who could destabilize a fragile peace. But fate, which had protected him through cavalry charges, tank battles, and artillery barges, had a final, cruel twist in store. It would not grant him a warrior's death. There would be no final stand, no bullet with his name on it. On December 9th, 1945, the day before he was scheduled to fly home to the United States, possibly to start that controversial speaking tour, Patton decided to go pheasant hunting near Mannheim. He was riding in the back of his 1938 Cadillac staff car, driven by Private Horace Woodring. It was a cold, clear Sunday morning. Patton was relaxed, looking out the window at the ruins of the German war machine he had helped destroy. He pointed to a heap of rusted vehicles on the side of the road and commented to his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." Moments later, a 2.5-ton U.S. Army truck, driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson, suddenly turned left across the road, directly in front of Patton's Cadillac. The cars were not moving fast, perhaps only 20 or 30 miles per hour. The driver of the Cadillac slammed on the brakes. The collision was relatively minor. The fenders were crunched, the radiator smashed. The two men in the front seat were unhurt. General Gay in the back seat was unhurt, but Patton had been thrown forward. His head struck the glass partition behind the driver's seat. He collapsed back onto the seat, paralyzed from the neck down. He asked General Gay, "Are you hurt?" Gay said no. Patton replied, "I think I'm paralyzed. I can't move my fingers." He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg. For 12 days, the man of blood and guts lay in a hospital bed, trapped in a broken body. The doctors, the best in the Allied armies, could do nothing. His spinal cord was severed. There were no grand speeches, no final battles, just a quiet, agonizing fade. He told his wife, "This is a hell of a way to die." On December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton Jr. died in his sleep of a pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial, alongside the men of his Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He did not want to be buried in Arlington. He wanted to lie with his troops. The death of Patton solved a massive problem for the Allied leadership. He died a hero before his political outbursts could fully tarnish his legacy. He died before the Cold War officially began, a conflict he had predicted but would not live to see. So, why was Patton never trusted with full control? Why was the best tactical commander of the war always a subordinate? The answer lies in the nature of modern war itself. World War II was not won by gallantry alone. It was won by logistics, by alliances, and by politics. It was a corporate war, and Patton was a feudal knight. He was too volatile for the delicate china shop of coalition warfare. He was a man who could win a battle in 48 hours, but could lose a nation's goodwill in 48 seconds. Eisenhower, Marshall, and Bradley understood something that Patton never did. In a total war, the general is not just a warrior. He is a statesman. Patton was incapable of being anything other than what he was, a pure, unadulterated instrument of violence. He was a sword that the Allies needed to wield, but he was also the sword that, if held too loosely, would cut the hand that held it. He was the perfect man for war, an impossible man for peace. And perhaps, in the end, the tragedy of George Patton was not that he was leashed, but that he was born into a world that no longer had room for him to run free.